disasters, they're already desensitized, they'll already be prepared in order to prevent the transmission of disease. You do want to think about things like bathing facilities after an emergency. It's not something that everyone thinks about first. They think about distributing water, they think about building latrines, but they don't think about where are people going to bathe in the aftermath of an emergency. Where are people going to do laundry? And then, very importantly, what are you going to do with all that runoff water that's created by the bathing and the laundry? So these are some basically bathing units in a camp that I was at. And if you notice, behind here is a big trench where all the water runoff went into. And what's going to happen if you just leave that trench filled with water runoff? You're going to get mosquitoes, right? And so you need to think about how you're going to do drainage in order to prevent standing water that's going to cause mosquitoes. So one of the things we do is we fill these with rocks so that the water drains in and mosquitoes aren't able to breed. You can also put some oil on top of the water, which also prevents mosquito breeding on top. There are a lot of different ways, but the key is you need to be thinking about all of these things in advance. Yes? What? Well, why might it be better not to have a roof? Right, ventilation and drying, so that the water on the ground will dry more quickly and not be muddy when the next person walks in, but also not to allow for mosquitoes to breed. So these are not fancy facilities, right? These are just structures, and someone's going to bring a bucket of water into that structure, and they're going to wash themselves with the bucket, and then they're going to walk out with the bucket. So these are very simple facilities that don't take very long to build. They're obviously not ideal, but they're what we often have to use when homes have been destroyed after a disaster. Okay, shelter and non-food items. So I always kind of go through this. So there are a lot of different options for settlements. So we're talking about a situation where an earthquake, a typhoon, a flood comes and damages a lot of homes. And people then need a place to live, right? So what are the different options for where people can live after a disaster has damaged their homes? What are the options? Yeah? Yeah? Great. That was perfect. So I like the way that you listed those two, because you listed them in order, right? So the ideal situation is that people can stay in place. You can figure out how to rehabilitate their homes quickly, maybe so it's not perfect, but so it's good enough for them to still live there. Because of course, all of us would rather just stay in our home, even if it's partially destroyed. We'd rather stay in our home than move anywhere else. And that's always going to be the best option. If that's not possible, then having other locations where people can stay with friends, family, neighbors. So maybe if you've had an earthquake come through and some of the homes have been destroyed, but other homes are okay, you can help people find other places to stay within their own community. And that's the next most ideal situation. Then you have things like apartment blocks. So for instance, a lot of times we take universities. Those are great places that have a lot of housing for students. And sometimes we can move families into the universities, into those housings. If there are empty apartment blocks for some reason, we can move people into those apartment blocks. If there are any sort of communal type housing that we can utilize, those are great options to move people into. Temporary communal multifamily housing, so for instance, a church. This is now like we don't have actual apartments, all the homes have been destroyed, we can't rehabilitate them, but we have some churches, some mosques that are still standing, so we can have multiple families living in a church or a mosque or in some other community structure that is still standing and still safe to live in. And The last and almost worst thing is a well-managed camp. That is probably the second worst place for people to live after a disaster because they're living in tents, they're living close together, they're far from their homes. Even the best well-managed camp is not going to be as nice as all of these other options for people to live in. But a well-managed camp is better than one option. Does anyone know what that is? A unplanned or poorly managed camp. That is the worst option. And so, if all of these are unavailable, then a well-managed camp is still going to be better than an unplanned camp will be. So if you are planning a camp, and this sphere of standards specifically refers to a displaced persons camp, then you need 45 meters of land per person. So when you're planning the camp, you need to think about, do you have enough space to actually have a camp there for all of the people that you have? There are lots of different considerations that go into planning the site for the camp. I won't go into all of them, but I will tell you that you need to talk to everybody. You need to be talking to national government, to local government. You need to talk to the private owners of that land, and you need to figure out what is going to be the best site. Of course, it's ideal to do this in advance, right? So not to have to do this during a disaster, but instead to say, okay, for our community, if all of the houses in our community were destroyed and we had to set up a temporary camp nearby, what piece of land would be the best piece of land to set up that camp? And there's a lot of different options for different places. I've seen camps that are better or worse. When you're doing your environmental assessment to figure out where you're going to set up your camp, you should think about these different things. So the quality of the roads to get to the camp, the water access, is there surface water nearby? Is there a good water table so we could dig boreholes if we needed to there? You want to think about the gradient. So if you want it to be less than 5% gradient in order to reduce runoff, so you don't have water running through your camp. But you do also want it to be more than 1% in order to have some runoff so you don't get vectors, basically, so you don't have mosquitoes breeding in standing water. You also want to think about the fire risk and other hazards. Like you don't want to build your camp right underneath an area where there could be landslides. And so these are all things to keep in mind. When you are creating a displaced persons camp, it's not just about the houses. Everyone thinks about just the shelters for people to live in. But you need all of these other things. You need cooking facilities, schools, health centers, places of worship, meeting places, recreational places, child play spaces, waste areas where you're going to put all the trash, burial sites, and camp administration. So you need to be thinking about all of the other services you need to have there in addition. And this, could actually go for a non-camp scenario as well. If you have a destroyed community, even if people are going to be sheltering in place, you need to make sure that all of these services are still functional in that community after the disaster. Third question? Questions? All right. And then livelihood. So this is also very important to think about. It's not just the people. You also need to think about their livelihood. So what do? So if they're an agricultural community, are they going to have land to grow crops on? Are they going to have land to grow their gardens? If they're a pastoral community, will they have a place to put their cows or their other animals? And you need to think about markets, places where people can purchase materials and foods, and places where people can set up businesses to sell materials and foods, because we don't want the population to have to depend wholly on the donor community. We want them to be able to actually practice their livelihoods after the disaster as well. That includes workshops, and very important, it includes internet access. This was a picture from a camp in Haiti that I was at after the earthquake there, where people were displaced, and this young woman found a source of electricity to plug her laptop into. And this is really important because everybody here in the Philippines and Southeast Asia has cell phones. They need a place to plug those in. They also need to have internet access so they can communicate, so they can continue to do their work and their business And so thinking about how you're going to set those services up quickly after an emergency are also really important. And then security, of course, is very important as well, especially if you're setting up a camp type of scenario. You need to make sure that you have proper guards, that you have good roads and pathways, and again, very important, lots of lighting everywhere, so that it's a safe place for people to be, including at night. All right, then for specific shelters, the SPHERE standard is a minimum of 3.5 square meters per person, which is kind of, again, the bare minimum. So these are just pictures of different types of shelters that I've seen used in lots of different types of humanitarian contexts with different displaced populations. So again, I've seen solid constructed buildings that were already in existence, in this case, school, where the school was turned into shelters for displaced people. That's nice because there's a roof that works when it rains. It's relatively warm inside at night. And even though you have a lot of people living together, it has a bit more solidity than a tent, for instance. You have these sort of rapid, large tents that you can put up that fit large numbers of people. They're good because you can put them up quickly. They're bad because who wants to live in a tent with 40 other people? That's not a very pleasant thing. You have kind of more permanent type structures that are built with wood and then have tin roofs. I can tell you when it's hot, those white tents get really hot inside. It is so much nicer to have a tin roof. We actually just published a paper showing that the Ebola treatment units in the Ebola outbreak in Liberia and Sierra Leone that had white tents had higher mortality on hot days than the ones that had tin roof tents, or wooden structures with tin roofs. Because when it gets really hot, people get even sicker. And people who are already sick are going to be even sicker if they're so hot inside. And then you have kind of individual family tents, which are a little bit better because at least you don't have to live with lots of other people. You can just be with your family. But of course, these take longer to set up. And then you have kind of individual wooden structures for families, which are a little bit nicer because you can actually stand up inside. And that actually makes a big difference between having to only be on your hands and knees inside your house versus being able to stand up inside. So in addition to the shelters, you also have to think about the non-food items. So this is a whole list of all the different types of non-food items that families need. Clothing, bedding, places to store food, and water, of course. Stoves, fuel, lighting, plastic sheeting, rope, tools, hygiene, health, and then other considerations. Can you buy this locally? Does it need to be shipped in? Are there functioning markets? Can you give people vouchers so that they can go, or cash so they can buy these items themselves instead of having to ship them in and distribute them to people? All right. Any questions about any of that? Okay. The last piece of this I want to talk about is health and outbreak surveillance and control. One area that I didn't get to in this talk is food and nutrition. You guys will have to open up the SPHERE handbook and read that part yourself. I just didn't have time to get to it, but again, everything that I'm talking about is there in the SPHERE handbook. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about in this section is in a different handbook, which is the WHO handbook on communicable disease and emergencies, which is also free online. You can download it. So the SPHERE standard for health, there are a whole bunch of them, but one of the most important ones is the number of health units and health personnel that you need for your population. So it says 1 health unit for every 10,000 people, a health center for every 50,000 people, and a district or rural hospital for every 250,000 people. Greater than 10 inpatient and maternity beds for every 10,000 people as well. So these are some basic ideas to give you a reference and to think about. You also need health workers because having hospitals and health centers are not very useful if you don't have doctors and nurses and community health workers to staff them. And SPHERE also has specific standards about how many of those you need. So for instance, you need 1 doctor for every 50,000 people. It'll tell you how many nurses you need. I think it's 2 for every 10,000 people or something like that. And that's all in the Spirit handbook. So one thing that's really important to think about is epidemics. Now, epidemics can actually be a disaster in and of themselves. If we think about things like the SARS pandemic, the Ebola pandemic, those were natural disasters that were caused by the epidemic itself. However, epidemics are also important after other types of natural disasters, whether it be earthquakes or floods or typhoons. Anything that disrupts people's normal life can make them at greater risk for an epidemic to occur. And so that means that every time you respond to a natural disaster, and every time you're thinking about planning for a natural disaster, you have to think about the possibility of an epidemic happening afterwards. And you have to be looking for it, because otherwise it will surprise you. And you don't want to be surprised. You want to be prepared. So, just a quick question I always ask, what's the difference between an epidemic and an outbreak? Or let me start by this, what is an epidemic? What's the definition of an epidemic? Yeah, I hear people are speaking it themselves very quietly. What's the definition of an epidemic? Spread of disease? Okay. What? In a particular location, okay, good. Widespread, okay. Increased incidence, right. So this is an important point. So an epidemic is a rise in the prevalence of a disease above the normal baseline for a given population, time, and place. So that means that you can have an epidemic of anything. Anything could be an epidemic. It doesn't have to actually be an infectious disease. So in the United States right now, we have an obesity epidemic because the prevalence of obesity in the United States has risen quickly in the last decade or so. But we often use this term for infectious diseases, and when we use it for infectious diseases, it's important to know a few things. So if you're going to look for a rise in the prevalence of disease, you need to know the baseline prevalence, right? So if you don't know the baseline prevalence, you're not going to know if it's rising or not. So that's important. And you also have to be looking at a specific population, time, and place. So you have to have data that's limited to that population, time, and place. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So an outbreak is actually just a lay term for an epidemic. It's not an official scientific term, it's a lay term for an epidemic, but outbreaks usually refer to an acute rise in the prevalence of an infectious disease, a communicable disease in a specific context. So while epidemic can be lots of different types of diseases, outbreak is usually just an infectious disease. And again, it's very limited usually to a specific place in a very short time period, like usually within a few days or weeks or months, but not many years. So these are the diseases with epidemic potential in humanitarian emergencies. And it's important to think about all these diseases, but you have to adapt it to your local context. So these four are the ones that are most common. Around the world, these are the four diseases that we see the most outbreaks from after natural disasters in humanitarian contexts. And some of them may be more or less important depending on your area. So for instance, in the Philippines, certainly diarrheal disease, respiratory tract infections are going to be very common after a disaster. You're going to have to look for outbreaks of these. Measles and malaria could still happen, but less common, but could still happen in the Philippines, but in another context, like sub-Saharan Africa, they might be very common, and you have to be very especially looking for them. Here in the Philippines, you don't have to worry about viral hemorrhagic fever. There's no viral hemorrhagic fever here in the Philippines, so you don't have to be looking for it. But some of these other things might be things that you could see, whether it be dengue or typhoid, meningitis, hepatitis, etc. So whatever your local context is, If there is disease there before the natural disaster, then there is a risk for that to become an epidemic after the natural disaster. So the first step in preparing, basically, and looking for, or doing what we call surveillance for an epidemic, is you have to have a case definition. You have to be able to define the disease. And you have to be able to define it in a very simple way. And so that's why the World Health Organization has created all of these different case definitions for different diseases. And if you look up the WHO Handbook on Communicable Disease Emergencies, it will give you case definitions for every single disease that is a potential in a humanitarian emergency. But you have to adapt those case definitions to your local context as well. And part of what they will involve is there'll be a suspect case definition, which is just a simple clinical definition that any nurse or even community health worker can define. And then you'll have maybe a probable definition and then a confirmed definition, which is when you have a laboratory diagnosis. So when you've confirmed the disease by doing laboratory testing. So I'll give you an example. Cholera. Cholera is one of the most severe diarrheal diseases. There are cholera outbreaks right now around the world, and they're especially common in disaster situations. So right now we have cholera outbreaks in Yemen after the humanitarian catastrophe there. We've had cholera outbreaks in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. There's cholera outbreaks everywhere that there is disaster where cholera exists. So the simple suspect case definition, the simple clinical definition for cholera is any person over 5 years old who dies or gets severely dehydrated from diarrhea. That's it. You don't need to be a nurse or a doctor necessarily to make that definition. If you have a patient in your camp who's over 5 years old and they die from diarrhea, then that is a suspect cholera case right there. And the reason we make these definitions simple is so that it's easy in humanitarian situations for us to report them and to track them. Now, is that definitely cholera? No, it's not definitely cholera. When you have a suspect case, then you have to do laboratory testing to confirm it. But you won't know to do the laboratory testing unless you know how to suspect it. Okay, case registration. So this is basically at all of your health facilities, you need to make sure that they're keeping track of all of the patients who come in. At the very least, doing a simple line listing like this, where they list out the patient and the diagnosis and what they're coming in with. And that's really important because it can help us decide if the incidence of the disease is really going up above the baseline. Now, I talked about the case definition, that's how you define whether somebody has a disease. There's also an epidemic threshold. That's how you define if your disease has turned into an epidemic. I'm not going to go into details, it's different for every disease, how you define it, but it's important to keep in mind. For certain diseases, such as cholera, measles, typhus, plague, yellow fever, even one case is considered an outbreak in a displaced population camp. So very important to think about that and keep that in mind. So if you are collecting all of this data at all of your health facilities, hopefully somebody has access to Microsoft Excel or a database and they're typing the data in, and then you can produce these types of graphs. So these are graphs from a camp that I worked in South Sudan, and you can see, starting in May 2012, the incidence of watery diarrhea went up very quickly in the camp. So does that mean that there was an outbreak of diarrhea in the camp? Is there an epidemic of diarrhea in the camp? Yes or no? Maybe, but what's one other piece of information you need to know? What? Right, so you need to know the baseline, but let's say this is the baseline. What you need to know is this population static or is it changing, right? Because what if there's just a lot of people who are coming into the camp over this time period, and then the actual prevalence of the disease isn't changing, it's just the number of people are increasing, so of course you have more people with disease. So that's very important to know, is that you have to standardize these. You have to look at it not just based on the number of cases, but the number of cases per population. And so usually we divide it by 1,000 people and look at the number of cases for every 1,000 people in a population. Similarly, this from the same camp, rates of malaria were very low at the beginning, and then they started to increase over time. And I want to ask you why. This is a special case where you have a population that had very low incidence of malaria, and then it moved into an area where malaria was endemic. And so they had no immunity to malaria, and so as they're living in that area, the longer they live in it, the more people are getting infected with malaria. So that's again something to think about if you have populations that are being displaced, especially being displaced into more rural areas or forested areas where you have different diseases than you might have had in the urban center where you lived before. So I'll just quickly talk about outbreak control. That's the last piece of this. So everything I talked about before was outbreak surveillance, how you look for and prepare for an outbreak. When an outbreak occurs, there are basically 3 different things you can do. So the first is you can try and prevent exposure. So you can try to prevent people from getting exposed to the disease. So if it's a disease that's transmitted through water, like cholera, then you can try and make sure that people have better access to clean water, better access to sanitation. If it's a disease like pneumonia that's spread from people coughing on each other, then making sure that people have better shelters, right? Less people crowded together in one shelter and more spread out means less pneumonia transmission. And similarly, if it's malaria, you want to be doing vector control and controlling the mosquitoes. The next thing you can do is preventing disease. So this means that even after people get exposed, preventing them from getting sick. And how do you do that? The best way is good nutrition. And then after that, vaccination. So making sure, for instance, that everybody is vaccinated for measles is the best way to prevent measles outbreak. Making sure especially that children under 5 have access to good nutrition is going to make it less likely that they'll get sick from pneumonia or diarrhea or malaria or other diseases. And then finally, the last thing that you can do is, even once they become sick, you can prevent them from dying. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you have adequate health facilities and well-trained health personnel, nurses and doctors, who can quickly diagnose and treat disease. Most of those diseases that I showed are very treatable if you have the right treatments available. And you can protect people and prevent them from dying. But if you don't have the right treatment available, then people will die. Cholera is a great example. Without treatment, 10% of people with cholera will die. With good treatment, less than 1 in 1,000 people with cholera will die. So it's very important to think about having access to that. And that is it. So hopefully that 1 hour overview of SCEAR was good enough to get you excited, get you to download the handbook and to read it. And for anything that I didn't cover, we definitely will have more chance to talk during the SCEAR simulation on Wednesday. You'll have a chance to put some of these things to actual practice in a simulated environment, and we'll have the chance to answer a lot more questions then. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. No more questions. Let me pass the microphone to Ms. Gray for some announcements.
Hi, are you guys still okay? Yes, yes. Don't worry, we hope we also had the same experience when we were in Brown. Mind-blowing discussions and always hungry. So, one of the key features of Brown meeting is that every lunch we had like what we call as keyword lunch. So, keyword lunch means that there are some labeled tables with keywords. So it's self-explanatory, right? So the keywords for today would be gender, spatial analysis,